Have you ever heard of the roads that never end? Where travelers are consumed by something greater than themselves. Today, we're going to tell you a story that's not just about the fear of the unknown, but about what happens when the road becomes your own prison. Prepare yourself for a terrifying experience that will challenge everything you know about the supernatural. Stay tuned, because in this video, you'll be confronted with the unexpected. Keep watching if you dare. The dawn was casting its shadow over Interstate 85, a long, desolate stretch that wound between dense forests and empty fields. Lisa adjusted her rearview mirror for the third time in less than 10 minutes. She didn't want to admit it, but there was something about the darkness of that road that bothered her. Mark, sitting next to her in the passenger seat, snored softly, while Kevin, in the back seat, typed something on his cell phone. "Don't you get tired of being on your cell phone, Kevin?" Lisa asked, more to break the silence than out of genuine curiosity. "Just trying to see where we are. The signal here is crap." He held up his phone, hoping for a connection point. "This road seems to never end." "It's only a few more hours," Lisa replied, trying to sound confident. "Anyway," Mark insisted, "it was faster this way." Mark mumbled something incoherent in his sleep and shifted. Lisa sighed, looking off into the distance. The car's built-in GPS was blinking intermittently, as if it were undecided about its next direction. The road was empty except for a truck that passed them by, briefly illuminating the interior of the vehicle with its high beams. Lisa felt a pang of relief when she saw another vehicle. She didn't feel so alone in this black expanse. Across the highway, John was gripping the steering wheel of his truck. This was his last delivery before a long-awaited day off. The electronics shipment was valuable, and he was determined to get there on time. The truck's radio, which was playing country music, began to hiss. John frowned, turning the knob to adjust the frequency. The hissing continued, interrupted only by a low sound, like a voice, but too indistinct to understand. "Damn," he muttered, turning off the radio. The music was his companion against sleep, but the static only irritated him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing the lights of a distant car. For a moment, he felt comforted. Deserted roads always gave the impression that something was wrong, and having another vehicle nearby, even if distant, was a reminder that he wasn't completely alone. "Did you see that?" Lisa asked suddenly. Kevin looked up from his phone. "See what?" "Over there, on the shoulder. There was someone standing there. It looked like a man, but he looked weird. He looked hunched over, like he was hurt." "You're imagining things." "I didn't see anything," Kevin replied in a nonchalant tone. Lisa squinted in the rearview mirror, but darkness had swallowed the shoulder. The air inside the car felt heavier, and for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Mark woke up suddenly, rubbing his eyes. "What's wrong? Why are you whispering?" "Nothing," Lisa said quickly. "Just keep sleeping." Mark shrugged, but the tone in Lisa's voice made him alert. He shifted in his seat, staring out the window. The forest seemed to get closer and closer to the road, as if the trees were closing in around them. John slammed on the brakes as something crossed the road in front of him. His headlights briefly illuminated what looked like a human figure, but it was too fast for him to make out. What the hell was that? He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, taking a deep breath. His mind tried to rationalize. It was probably a large animal, a deer or even a coyote. But the silhouette seemed wrong. Too long, but at the same time slender. He got out of the truck, the flashlight on his cell phone in hand. The bushes on the side of the road were still. He walked slowly, feeling the damp ground beneath his boots. There was nothing. "Just tired," he muttered, returning to the truck. But when he got into the cab, he noticed that something seemed different. The air had a strange, metallic smell. He checked the mirrors and started the engine, determined to continue on his way. "Mark, do you see this?" Lisa asked, pointing to the GPS. The screen flickered and displayed a map that made no sense, as if they had left the main route. "That's wrong. We should be on the interstate. Where are we?" "You're the one who should know. You're the one who insisted on this route," Lisa replied, her voice taking on a nervous tone. Kevin looked outside, noticing that the highway lights had disappeared. "This doesn't look right. No signal, no street lights, nothing." Mark pulled out his cell phone, but as Kevin had said before, the signal was non-existent. He huffed, trying to sound calm. "Just go back to the last exit. We must have gone straight past." Lisa nodded, turning the steering wheel to make a U-turn. But as she made the turn, the headlights illuminated something in the middle of the road. It was a human figure, or at least it looked like one. "Oh my God, what is that?" Kevin muttered, leaning forward. Lisa froze. The figure didn't move, just stood there, hunched over and motionless. Mark tried to open the window to shout, but before he could say anything, the car's lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the vehicle into total darkness. The silence inside the car was almost absolute, except for the sound of the three friends' rapid breathing. Outside in the darkness, something seemed to be moving, and for the first time, Lisa was certain that this trip would never be forgotten. The car remained stationary, immersed in oppressive darkness. Lisa repeatedly pressed the start button, but the engine did not respond. The silence was broken only by Kevin, who muttered softly, "This is not happening. This is not happening." Mark, always the most rational of the group, tried to remain calm. "Okay, everyone take a deep breath. It's just a problem with the car. Let's go out and take a look." "Are you crazy?" Lisa snapped, still gripping the steering wheel as if it were an anchor to reality. "You saw what was out there." "I didn't see anything but a figure," Mark replied, trying to sound firm. "It could have been a person. Maybe someone who needed help." Kevin leaned forward, his voice thick with sarcasm mixed with fear. "Or maybe it's the kind of thing you see in nightmares. Do you really want to risk it?" Lisa swallowed hard, but adrenaline made her give in. "Stay here. I'll call 911. She picked up her cell phone, but as she had already known, there was no signal. Not even a hint of connection. "Nothing," she muttered. "We're completely isolated." Meanwhile, miles away, John drove in silence, still feeling that something was wrong. The truck's lights cut across the empty road, but he couldn't shake the growing weight in his chest. In the distance, he saw what looked like a car stopped on the shoulder. John slowed down, noticing that the taillights were flashing in an irregular pattern, like a call for help. "Another problem on this damn road," he muttered, pulling the truck over carefully. He grabbed his flashlight and got out, hoping to find someone in trouble. The car was empty. John felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something strange about this vehicle. The doors were unlocked, and on the floor near the driver's seat was a cell phone that was flashing intermittently. He picked it up and saw that the screen displayed an incomplete message. "I'm on the shoulder. There's something." He took a step back, his eyes now scanning the road around him. It was quiet, perhaps too quiet. John was not a man who was easily frightened, but the emptiness of the road seemed to want to swallow him. "There's something moving out there," Kevin whispered, his face pressed against the glass of the rear window. Lisa didn't want to look, but her curiosity got the better of her. Forcing herself to look, she saw what Kevin was talking about. Shadows moving between the trees on the side of the road. "It must be the wind," Mark said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had before. "The wind isn't moving," Kevin snapped, his eyes wide. Before they could argue further, the car shook slightly, as if something had hit it. Lisa screamed, and Kevin fell back in his seat, dropping his cell phone. "Mark, do something," Lisa pleaded. Mark opened the car door and got out quickly, ignoring the protests of the other two. "I'm going to see what it is. If we just stand here, we'll just scare ourselves more." He took a few steps toward the hood, holding his cell phone like a makeshift flashlight. The air was freezing, and the silence seemed amplified. The only thing he could hear was the sound of his own footsteps on the asphalt. John got back into the truck, trying to shake off his uneasiness. He decided to keep driving, but as he accelerated, something flashed in the rearview mirror. It was as if a figure was watching him from afar. "Must be tired," he told himself, although he knew he wasn't convinced. The truck's headlights illuminated a sign ahead. "Alternate access, 10 miles. The GPS, which had seemed confusing until then, indicated that he should take the shortcut. John hesitated. The main road was more reliable, but time was tight, and a 10-mile detour could be enough to save hours. He turned right, onto the alternate access. As soon as he made the turn, the radio crackled again, this time louder and more continuous. John tried to turn it off, but the hissing seemed to come from every direction, as if the cabin itself were making the sound. Mark got back into the car, his face pale. "There's nothing out there. Maybe we hit a branch or something." Lisa frowned, noticing that he looked distraught. "Are you okay?" "I am," he said quickly, avoiding her gaze. "We just need to get out of here as soon as possible." She tried to start the car again, and this time the engine responded with a hesitant roar. The headlights came on again, illuminating the road ahead. But then Kevin shouted, "Over there, on the shoulder. Do you see them?" Lisa looked, and her heart raced. The figure was back, motionless, but closer now. It was tall, hunched over, and seemed to be looking right at them. "Step on it," Mark shouted. Lisa obeyed, accelerating the car. The figure disappeared into the darkness as they passed, but no one in the car felt safe. "This isn't normal," Kevin said, his voice shaking. "Whatever it is, we need to get off this road," Lisa replied, trying to ignore the feeling that they were being followed. John continued on the alternative access, but something seemed wrong. The road was narrow and lined with tall trees that blocked the moonlight. He looked at the GPS again, but the screen now displayed only one message: "Recalculating." "Recalculating what?" he muttered, feeling sweat dripping down his forehead. Suddenly, something crossed the road in front of him, too fast for him to identify. He slammed on the brakes, but when he stopped, there was nothing there. John felt his chest tighten. The same feeling from before, as if he were being watched, returned, but this time it was more intense. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made his blood run cold. A pair of glowing eyes reflecting the truck's taillight. The highway seemed increasingly suffocating, as if the road itself were conspiring against its travelers. As Lisa tried to maintain control of the car, and John continued his uncertain journey, they both knew, even without admitting it, that they were entering territory they should not explore. Lisa drove with her hands firmly on the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, with no signs, exits, or any sign of civilization. It was as if space itself was distorting around them. How many miles do we have left? Kevin asked, but no one answered. The truth was no one knew. Mark, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced at the rearview mirror frequently, as if expecting to see something or someone approaching. Kevin kept looking outside, but what he saw only increased his uneasiness. Those trees, they seem closer now, he said, almost in a whisper. Lisa ignored him, focusing only on the road ahead. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt the same way. It was as if the shadows of the trees were slowly advancing, compressing the road. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the car, a thud, as if something had hit the roof. Lisa screamed, slamming on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. "Oh my God, what was that?" Kevin yelled, gripping the back of the front seat. Mark opened the door before anyone could stop him. "Stay here. I'll go check." "Are you crazy?" Kevin exclaimed, but Mark was already out. Lisa glanced back, trying to calm her breathing. "Mark, don't go far." Mark walked around the car, shining his phone on the roof. There was nothing there, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes scanned the forest around him, trying to find some explanation. Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like distant laughter. Mark spun around quickly, shining his light on the trees to his left. "Who's there?" he yelled, but the only answer was silence. He hurried back to the car, his heart racing. "I didn't see anything," he said, getting in the vehicle and locking the door immediately. "But we have to get out of here now." Lisa didn't need any more encouragement. She started the car and sped off, ignoring the road ahead. It didn't matter where they were going, as long as it was away from here. Meanwhile, John was still on the bypass. The road was getting narrower and narrower, and the trees seemed to close in on the truck. He looked at the GPS again, but the screen now showed only static lines. "This is wrong," he muttered to himself. And then he saw it. Ahead, on the side of the road, stood a figure. It was tall, hunched over, and appeared to be dressed in something that hung like strips of old cloth. John slowed down hesitantly. He didn't want to stop, but he couldn't ignore what he was seeing. As the truck got closer, the headlights illuminated the figure better. It was a man, or something that looked human, but his face was completely obscured by shadows. John drove straight past, his heart racing, but when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure had disappeared. "It can't be," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But before he could calm down, something slammed into the side of the truck with enough force to make the cabin shake. He glanced at the side mirror, but there was nothing there. "It's just paranoia, just tiredness." He tried to repeat the words like a mantra, but deep down he knew there was something about these roads, something that wasn't natural. Back in Lisa's car, the tension was suffocating. No one was saying a word, but everyone knew something was wrong. "Did you notice the moon disappeared?" Kevin asked, finally breaking the silence. Lisa glanced up at the sky quickly. He was right. The moon, which should have been illuminating the road, was obscured, or worse, it seemed to have disappeared. "That doesn't make sense," Mark said, looking at his phone again. "We still don't have signal. It's not normal to be like this for so long." Kevin looked at his watch. "My watch stopped. This is too much of a coincidence." Lisa tried to remain calm. "Okay, we're all tired and scared. We need to think clearly." But before she could finish her sentence, the headlights illuminated something on the road. Another figure. "No!" Lisa screamed, slamming on the brakes once more. The car stopped a few feet away from the figure. This time, she wasn't standing still. She started walking toward them, slowly and deliberately. "Step on the gas." Mark yelled, but Lisa was frozen. The figure got closer and closer, and when it was just a few meters away, something else happened. The car lights flickered and went out again, plunging them into total darkness. Kevin started to scream, but his voice was drowned out by a sound coming from outside. Footsteps surrounding the car. Lisa tried to start the car, but the engine only sputtered. "We're trapped," Mark muttered, and for the first time, his voice betrayed genuine fear. In the suffocating darkness of the road, the sounds around the car became increasingly intense. Footsteps, laughter, and something that seemed to be scratching the bodywork created a cacophony of terror. Lisa knew that the only way out was to keep going, but at that moment, the car sounded like a metal coffin about to be sealed. The sounds around the car intensified, creating a suffocating atmosphere. It was impossible to distinguish where they were coming from. Sometimes they sounded like quick footsteps, sometimes scratches on the bodywork, and, at times, muffled laughter that sent shivers down the spine. Lisa gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying not to lose control. The car's engine still wasn't responding, leaving them at the mercy of whatever was out there. "Start the car, Lisa. For God's sake," Kevin shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm trying." She pressed the ignition button repeatedly, but the engine only whined, with no sign of life. Mark looked around, trying to see something in the darkness beyond the fogged-up window. "We have to get out of here. We can't just stand there." "And go where?" Kevin snapped, his eyes wide. "Do you want to go out and get caught by whatever this is?" Lisa turned the key again, and this time the engine roared back to life. The car's lights came on, illuminating the road ahead, empty, as if nothing had happened. "Go, go, go." Mark insisted, and Lisa didn't hesitate. She stepped on the gas, and the car shot forward, leaving the cacophony that surrounded them behind. Meanwhile, on the side road, John continued his journey, but the environment around him was changing. The road seemed to be narrowing even further, and the tall trees gave way to twisted, sinister shapes that resembled hands reaching for something. He rounded a sharp curve, but as he turned, his headlights illuminated something ahead, an old wooden sign. "No return." John braked sharply, the truck skidding a few feet before coming to a stop. He got out, flashlight in hand, and approached the sign. It looked like it had been there for decades, covered in moss and deep scratches. "No return," he muttered to himself, running his fingers over the sign, as if trying to touch it would make more sense. A sound came from the forest, a loud crack, followed by hurried footsteps. John turned, shining his flashlight into the trees, but all he saw were shadows dancing in the wind. He hurried back to the truck, feeling his heart pound. As he sat back in the driver's seat, he noticed something that made him freeze. There were handprints on the windshield, long, with fingers that looked impossibly thin. Back in the car, Lisa drove as fast as she could, but the sense of safety was elusive. The GPS on the dashboard was blinking, now completely out of control, showing coordinates that made no sense. Kevin tried to remain calm, but his body was shaking uncontrollably. "This isn't a normal road. We're trapped." "No one's trapped, Kevin." Mark snapped, trying to sound firm, but even he could tell something was wrong. "We just need to find a way out." Lisa glanced at the dashboard and realized that the gas tank was dangerously low. "This can't be real. I filled it up before we left." "Maybe that's part of whatever's going on here," Kevin replied, his voice filled with desperation. The tension in the car was palpable. But then Lisa saw something up ahead that almost made her stop. A truck! The vehicle's taillights were flashing intermittently, like a warning sign. Finally, someone, Lisa said, speeding up to catch up with the truck. Are you sure this is a good idea? Kevin asked, looking to Mark for support. We need help, Mark replied, although his expression showed that he was also apprehensive. Lisa slowed down and honked, trying to get the truck driver's attention. The taillights flashed again, but the truck didn't stop. John saw the car's headlights in the rearview mirror and felt a brief relief. But then he noticed something strange. The car was flashing its headlights in an uncoordinated, almost frantic manner. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead. But then the radio crackled again, this time louder. He turned it off, but the sound continued, as if it were coming from inside his head. A distorted voice emerged from the crackling, mumbling something he couldn't understand. John pressed the volume button repeatedly, trying to silence it, but the voice only grew louder. Suddenly, the truck's lights began to flicker, and the engine lost power. He glanced at the dashboard. Everything was working, but the vehicle seemed to be dying. Lisa and the others watched as the truck began to slow down. She seized the opportunity and parked behind it, jumping out of the car before anyone could protest. Lisa, wait! Mark shouted, but she was already banging on the truck door. Please, we need help, she begged, but the answer was silence. John, still in the cab, looked at Lisa in the rearview mirror. He hesitated before opening the window, but he knew he had to do something. Who are you? He asked, trying to sound calm. My name is Lisa, she answered quickly. We're lost, and something is following us. Do you know how to get out of here? John frowned. This road, it's not normal. I'm trying to find a way out too, but I think we're stuck. John's words felt like a sentence. Lisa felt her legs weaken, but Mark reached out and grabbed her arm. Did you see anything? He asked John, trying to sound more confident than he actually was. John hesitated before answering. I saw things I can't explain. Lisa and John's reunion brought a brief glimmer of hope, but the tension didn't ease. Something was wrong with this road, something that seemed to be toying with them, like predators cornering their prey. Together, they decided to continue on their journey. But what awaited them ahead was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The truck and the car were now parked side by side on the desolate road. The two groups had reunited, but the relief of finding other survivors quickly turned into an atmosphere filled with doubt and fear. You said you're lost too? Lisa asked John, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound firm. John nodded, crossing his arms as he looked around at the darkness. This road doesn't follow the rules. It changes, isolates you, and I think it draws you here. Kevin approached uneasily. What do you mean draws? Do you think we're here by chance? I don't know, John replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something to appear. But no one who enters here leaves the same way, if they leave at all. As they argued, Mark stood beside the truck, scanning the trees around them. Something in the shadows seemed denser, more alive than before. He could feel the gaze of something invisible on them, but he didn't dare mention it. What about the gas? Lisa asked John, trying to change the focus. My tank was full, but now it's almost empty. That's part of the trap, John replied. Normal rules don't apply here, and the more you resist, the more this thing feeds on you. Mark, who had been listening in on the conversation from a distance, interrupted. Are you saying this road is alive? John hesitated before answering. Maybe not alive in the sense we know it, But there is something here. Something that watches us, manipulates us. Kevin gave a nervous laugh. Great, now we're stuck in a horror movie. This isn't a movie, Kevin, Lisa replied, her tone sharper than she'd intended. We need to figure out how to get out of here. As the two argued, John glanced back at the truck's windshield. The handprints were still there, and now they seemed deeper, as if they'd been etched into the glass. You didn't hear anything strange? He asked hesitantly. Lisa frowned. Noises, laughter, footsteps, is that what you mean? John nodded slowly. Yes, and if that's what I think, we're being tested. Tested? Mark asked, his voice thick with disbelief. To see how far we'll go before we break, John replied. That's how it works. It plays on your fears, wears you down until you make a mistake. Kevin crossed his arms, trying to look skeptical. But the truth was that every word John said made sense, even if he wanted to deny it. Lisa looked at the road ahead, trying to find some logic in the chaos. So what's the plan? Keep driving until something happens. We have no choice, John replied. But we need to stick together. Whatever this is, it's trying to divide us. The decision was made. They would drive together, with Lisa's car in front and John's truck close behind. The idea of being together gave them a false sense of security. But at least it was something to hold on to. As they drove on, the surroundings became even stranger. The road seemed to be winding in on itself, with twists and turns that neither group could remember seeing before. In the car, Kevin stared out the window, his eyes fixed on the dense forest. He saw something moving between the trees, a tall, gangly shadow that seemed to be following them closely. Lisa, speed up, he said, his voice low but urgent. Why? She asked, not taking her eyes off the road. There's something following us, Kevin replied, now pointing out the window. Mark looked in the same direction, but all he saw was darkness. You're seeing things. It's fear messing with your head. No, I know what I saw. Kevin insisted, but Lisa ignored him, trying to stay calm. In the truck, John was also on alert. He saw something in the side mirror, a tall figure, the same type he'd seen before, but closer this time. You're not going to catch me like that, he muttered, stepping on the accelerator. But just as the truck began to pick up speed, the road changed again. Up ahead, the headlights illuminated something unexpected, an intersection. He picked up the radio and called Lisa. Hey, do you guys see that? From the car, Mark radioed back. An intersection? That wasn't here before. It doesn't matter, Lisa replied. This could be our chance. Chance of what? Kevin asked, his tone mixed between hope and fear. Out of here, Lisa replied. But deep down, even she didn't fully believe it. When they reached the intersection, the group stopped to discuss. The road split into 3 directions, but none of them looked more inviting than the other. Left, right, or straight ahead? Mark asked, looking at John. John scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable. It doesn't matter which one we choose. He'll just change the path again. So how do we decide? Lisa asked. Maybe that's what he wants, Kevin replied. To make us choose and lose ourselves even more. What if we just keep going? Mark suggested, without thinking too much, without dividing ourselves. That makes sense, John agreed, albeit hesitantly. The group decided to keep going, but as they started down the road, something changed. The atmosphere grew heavier, as if the air itself was charged. The trees around them seemed to move, creating human shapes that watched them silently. In the car, Kevin tried not to look directly, But he couldn't help it. He saw one of the shapes move closer, and this time, there was a face. It was the face of someone he knew, his brother, who had disappeared years ago. Kevin gasped, blinking repeatedly. But when he looked again, the figure had disappeared. As they drove along the road, the tension reached its peak. The feeling that something was about to happen grew exponentially. With every mile they drove, the group got closer not to an exit, but to a revelation that would change everything. The intersection was behind them, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't diminish. The sound of the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness, everything seemed normal. But inside the car and the truck, fear solidified, like an invisible weight. They were being watched, not just by unseen eyes in the darkness, but by something much older and crueler. Lisa kept her eyes on the road, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. "We can't stop. We're going to keep going." "What do you mean, keep going?" Kevin asked, his voice thick with skepticism. "Where exactly are we going?" She glanced at the rearview mirror, trying to find some answer. But what she saw was something that made her freeze completely. There was something behind them. Not an ordinary shadow, but a hazy shape that followed them in the distance. The car's lights reflected something that seemed to move, but without a defined shape, as if the air itself was distorting, creating a specter. "Lisa, what is that?" Mark asked, looking at the rearview mirror as well, his tone revealing a panic he was trying to suppress. She didn't answer right away. Fear took hold of her, but she didn't want to give in. "It's just a mirage. Stay calm." But deep down, she knew it wasn't a mirage. On the other side, John was beginning to doubt his own sanity. He had faced strange events before, but nothing compared to what was happening here. The radio was still crackling, and now he could hear something clearly. A hoarse, distant voice, whispering his name. "John." He looked at the truck's controls, searching for something to interrupt the transmission. But there was nothing. The voice seemed to come from inside his mind, like psychological torture. "John, you can't escape." He clenched his fists against the steering wheel, feeling sweat dripping down his forehead. The truck's headlights illuminated a sign ahead, but as he got closer, he noticed something strange. It said, "You never left." John stopped the truck abruptly, the tires squealing on the deserted road. He looked at the sign, and then at the road ahead. There were no more forks, no changes in direction. The road continued in a straight line, but there was something grotesque and oppressive about the monotony of the landscape. "I never left," he murmured, his heart pounding. Back in the car, Lisa tried to remain calm. The road seemed endless, and the trees that had previously seemed to be in the distance now approached, as if they wanted to swallow the road whole. The sound of the wind, mixed with the hiss of the radio, made the sensation of being watched more intense by the second. "We need to stop. We need to talk about this," Mark said, breaking the tense silence. Lisa took her eyes off the road for a moment, staring at him. "Talk about what?" "About all this. This isn't normal. We're not on a normal road anymore." He looked out the window, where the trees curved unnaturally. "And more importantly, why don't we feel like we're going anywhere? Every mile feels the same as the last." "I know, Mark. I feel that way too," Lisa admitted, in a tone of voice she didn't usually use. "But where can we go? We have no choice. And if we go back, maybe it will be worse." Kevin stared out the window, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "We can't go back. There's no way to go back to the way it was before." The silence filled the car for a long moment. Lisa knew there was a grain of truth to what Kevin was saying. Something about this place had changed them in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. And worse, time seemed to have stopped, with the road stretching out endlessly before them, with no sign of an end. Meanwhile, John was transfixed by the sign. He knew something was terribly wrong, but the idea of leaving seemed impossible. He picked up the radio and spoke, trying to reach Lisa. "Lisa, are you listening to this?" Her voice, distorted with tension, answered, "Yes, we are." "And what is this sign? What is going on here?" John took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. "I don't know, but I don't think we ever really left. No matter what we do, the road always brings us back. So what should we do?" Lisa asked, now visibly agitated. I'm not sure, but all I know is that something is controlling us, and if the road won't let us leave, we have to face it head on." "Face the road?" Kevin repeated, in a tone of disbelief. "Yes, maybe that's the key," John replied. "We need to see what's really behind all this. We can't keep running away." Suddenly, the road ahead began to change. The trees parted, giving way to a vast, dark clearing where an old cabin stood alone, covered in moss and with broken windows. It was completely isolated, but it emanated a sense of deep unease. "We can't stop here," Mark said, looking at the cabin with apprehension. But Lisa, without hesitation, slowed the car. "We have to stop." "I know it." The car and truck pulled up in front of the cabin, and the group got out, hesitantly, trying to keep together. The air was cooler here, and the only light that illuminated the scene came from the full moon. The shadows of the cabin seemed to move, and a low, almost imperceptible sound, like breathing, seemed to emanate from the place. John approached the cabin door, his heart racing, the feeling that something was waiting for them there, something they could no longer ignore. When he touched the handle, the door slowly opened, without making a sound. Inside the cabin, the air was damp and heavy, and the floor creaked with each step they took. In one corner, there was an old table covered with papers and an open diary. Lisa approached and looked at the yellowed pages. She read aloud, "The road calls us. It feeds on those who try to escape. There is no end. There is no freedom. Only the eternal cycle of escape and hunting." The last paragraph made her stop reading. She looked at the others, feeling a wave of horror wash over her. This is what's happening. The road, it wants us here. We can't leave. The revelation in the cabin brought new understanding, but also a new layer of despair. They weren't just trapped on the road. They were being manipulated by something much bigger, something that was playing with their minds and dragging them deeper and deeper into the darkness. The cabin seemed alive in some incomprehensible way, as if its walls and timbers were breathing along with the group. Lisa, still holding the journal in her hands, looked at the others, the vision of their words echoing in her mind. The idea of being trapped in an endless cycle was starting to solidify. She had read everything the journal said, but the words still didn't make sense. "What does this mean?" Mark asked, his gaze fixed on the paper. He approached slowly, his face illuminated by the light of the flashlight they carried. "Who wrote this?" Lisa took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. "I think someone who has been through the same thing we have, or worse. This road, this curse. It seems like we are all doomed to this." The idea of being in an eternal cycle of hunting made everyone's nerves jitter. They were beginning to understand what they didn't want to understand. But there was one thing Lisa felt deeply. Something or someone was waiting to be confronted. "That's what it wants," John said, breaking the silence. He looked around, his eyes fixed on the shadows that stretched along the walls of the cabin. The road brings us here, and then it watches us. It waits. It changes us. The hunt is about to begin. Are you saying that if we stay here, we'll end up like everyone else? Kevin asked, his tone somewhere between anger and desperation. John shook his head, his eyes narrowing. Yes, and worse. Maybe the road makes us predators or prey. I don't know, but we have to get out before it loses us forever. Lisa put the journal back on the table and took a step back, feeling the sensation that they were no longer alone. The cabin was becoming oppressive, as if their presence there was feeding something. Their breathing seemed heavier, the air thicker. Suddenly, a crash came from outside, like the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Everyone turned toward the broken window, their eyes wide, but they could see nothing but the darkness that seemed to swallow everything ahead. The noise repeated itself, louder this time, followed by a muffled scream. It was human, but distorted, as if it came from someone who had long since lost their sanity. "Let's go," Mark shouted, already moving toward the door. Now, but before they could reach the exit, the cabin door slammed shut. It wasn't just a gust of wind. Someone or something had blocked the way. They were trapped. "We can't get out," Lisa said, her voice full of panic. "We have to find a way to." But she was interrupted by a sound that chilled her blood. The sound of heavy breathing echoed through the cabin, coming from every direction. It was as if the very structure was breathing with them, with a malignant force. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway, obscured by shadow. It wasn't human, but it wasn't completely monstrous either. Its skin was covered in a crust of dirt and dried blood. Its eyes were two deep, empty, expressionless holes. And most of all, the movement. The creature moved as if in slow motion, but with a frightening grace. What is that?" Kevin whispered, trembling. "She isn't real," Mark said, trying to dispel the idea that this thing was something that could be confronted. "It's an illusion. Everything is an illusion." But before he could say anything else, the creature was advancing quickly towards them. There was no doubt. They were being hunted, and the road, with its mysteries and horrors, was waiting for them, ready to devour them. Lisa, in front of everyone, took a step back, not knowing what to do. The door was locked, and the only way to escape seemed to be to face what was ahead. But what was approaching seemed much more than any nightmare she could have imagined. "No, we're not going to fight. We're going to get out. We're going to run," John shouted, his eyes fixed on the creature. He didn't wait any longer, running towards the broken window. As he got closer, he saw that the figure was already about to attack him, its claws reaching out to grab him. But the truck was there, the engine still running. He shouted to the others, "Hurry up, come on. The truck might be our only chance." Kevin, still paralyzed by the sight of the creature, took a step forward. "We can't go to the truck, John. If the road really is alive, it's going to get us anyway." But panic had set in. There was no more time for debate. They all ran toward the truck. But as soon as they passed through the shattered door of the cabin, a deafening scream followed them. It wasn't a creature anymore. It was the road. Something was calling them back. Something moving between the heavens and the earth, waiting for the moment when they would become part of its web. The truck took them back to the road, but the lights no longer illuminated the way as before. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and even the sound of the engine was muffled, as if the truck was being consumed by the road itself. The feeling of having no control over what was happening intensified. They were no longer traveling. They were being dragged. As the truck sped along, The horizon began to change. The road was twisting into impossible curves, as if it were trying to swallow the vehicle. The creature, now visible in its entirety, seemed to be running alongside them, always in the distance, but never moving away. Lisa looked at John, his face reflected in the rearview mirror. The road brought us back, John. We are part of it now. No matter where we go, no matter what we do, it owns us. John, speechless, stared at the road ahead. They were no longer trying to escape. They were running towards something they didn't even understand, but which somehow seemed to be the only possible destination. The race along the road continued, but now, the true horror was about to be revealed. The hunt was not a fight for survival. It was a fight to understand what they were really up against. The truck was moving forward, but the road ahead was no longer the same. There were no more signs, just darkness, and the feeling that they were in a place where the rules of time and space did not apply. The truck's engine sounded muffled, almost as if the road was swallowing it. The group was silent, each immersed in their own thoughts, but all aware that something irremediable was about to happen. Lisa looked at the others, her eyes reflecting despair. We can't go on like this. The road it's taking over us. John, sitting in the driver's seat, was absorbed in what was happening ahead. I know, Lisa, but if we stop now, we'll be lost forever. Mark, who was in the back seat, looked out the window, watching the trees and the void stretch endlessly beside the road. If we stop, or if we don't do something soon, the road will swallow us anyway. We're all in it now. Kevin, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. And what do we do? How do we deal with this? We can't keep running, that's for sure. I don't know, Lisa said, her voice shaking. But something here isn't right. The road is taking us somewhere, and we need to find out where. The darkness seemed to deepen as the truck continued on its journey. The trees on the side of the road grew denser, their shapes distorted and eerie, as if they were slowly moving. The atmosphere was charged, almost as if the air had become thicker, harder to breathe. It was as if the environment itself was alive, a part of this cursed road. The radio, which had been silent until then, suddenly crackled, before emitting a distorted, barely audible voice. You can't leave. The voice seemed to come from inside their minds, a distant echo that seemed to drag through the thickness of the night. This isn't possible, John muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. We've heard it before. It's in our heads. But Lisa knew it wasn't just in their heads. The road was talking to them. The evil presence that inhabited it was guiding them, forcing them to move forward. Suddenly, the truck began to slow down, as if the road itself were resisting their movement. The headlights illuminated only a narrow path ahead, and as they advanced, the feeling of no longer being in control became more evident. We're stuck, Mark said, his tone full of resignation. This isn't going to end well. Don't think like that, Lisa replied, although the words sounded hollow even to her. We can still fight. But when she looked ahead, the path ahead seemed to begin to distort, creating a vortex that sucked in the light from the headlights, making everything even darker. The road seemed to open like a monstrous mouth, swallowing everything it touched. We're going to the end, Kevin said, his voice now desperate. There's no turning back. The truck stopped suddenly in the middle of the road. The engine purred, but it seemed to have no power, as if the life force that moved it had been taken away. Lisa tried to start the engine again, but nothing happened. The sound of the engine died, and darkness surrounded them, impenetrable. It's not possible, John said, his voice cracking with frustration. "Why aren't we going anywhere?" "Because there's nowhere to go," Lisa said, her voice cracking with tension. We never left. We never left the road." It was then that, suddenly, the sound of the headlights was interrupted by a presence, something they couldn't see, but they could feel. It was a sensation of intense cold, as if the air itself was freezing, cutting. And before they could react, the shadows began to move, and something began to take shape in the darkness. They were being watched, and now, the entity that hunted them was closer than ever. Lisa was the first to step out of the truck, fear driving her into action, as if something had forced her to step out and face what was there. She looked at the others, who were hesitant. "We have to face this. We can't keep running away." John followed close behind her, trying to remain calm. "This is a mistake. We can't fight whatever is here, but we have to try. If we don't do anything, the road will consume us completely." The feeling of being watched, of being in a place where time no longer had any meaning, intensified. And when Lisa looked back, she saw it. The road, in its most monstrous form, was stretching out behind them like a living entity, moving with an indescribable force. The road was becoming its own presence, a being that controlled them, manipulated them, made them move forward without purpose. "We're trapped in it," Kevin shouted, his voice filled with panic. "The road, it will never let us go." Lisa stared ahead, into the darkness. She knew there was no escape, no path forward. "If we're going to die here, at least let it be with some meaning. We need to understand what this all means. We need to know why we're here." She took a step forward, her courage now fueled by the sense that they were no longer just on an ordinary road. They were on something bigger, something that had control over their lives, their destinies. "Let's get on the road," John said, looking at Lisa. "Let's go all the way. We can't hide forever." And so, as the road consumed them, the group moved on. There was no path, no escape. They were being dragged into the abyss, to a destiny no one could understand. They were trapped in the curse of the road, where the end and the beginning merged, where the laws of time no longer applied. They had become part of the cycle, and there was no turning back. The end was near, and although fear gripped them, the truth behind the road was beginning to reveal itself. They were now one step closer to the final destination, where the understanding of what the road was, and who or what was behind it, would finally be revealed. The road seemed endless, and the darkness around them continued to swallow any hope that remained. Lisa, John, Mark, and Kevin had left the truck behind, heading toward the unknown. The air was thick, as if the earth itself was trying to trap them, preventing any possibility of escape. They had walked for hours, or maybe it was just a minute. Time seemed to be an irrelevant construct now. The road, the entity that hunted them, everything was merging into one big, meaningless mass. "I can't take this anymore," Mark said, his voice shaking. "Where are we? What is this place?" Lisa looked at him, trying to find some answer in her own thoughts. "I don't know, but we can't stop now. We have to find out." "Find out what?" Kevin replied, his tone bitter. "We already know enough. We're in hell, and the road is our prison." They were on the brink of despair. Fear, now palpable, gripped them with every step, but somehow they knew the real terror was yet to come. They weren't just running from a road. They were running from something much older, something that was watching their every move. And now, it was finally revealing itself. The road ahead began to twist, changing shape like a snake about to strike. The trees beside it stirred, their roots reaching out from the earth like tentacles that wanted to grab them. Lisa paused for a moment, her heart pounding, feeling that they were being watched, that something was about to step out of the darkness. And then she saw it. On the horizon, a shape began to emerge from the darkness, distorting the reality around them. It was a shadow, but not just any shadow. It seemed alive, as if it were a materialized mass of nightmares. Its outlines were vague, but its presence was unmistakable. The entity that had created the road. Is this real?" Mark asked, his voice a mixture of horror and disbelief. "I don't know," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "But it seems we can't run any further." The figure was getting closer, and the atmosphere around it seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating. The shadows stretched out, swallowing everything they touched. The road, which had once seemed like a simple path, was now a living trap, and the entity that ruled it was finally before them. The creature, if it could be called such, had no clear shape. Its edges were constantly distorting, as if reality itself were being torn apart around it. The shadows emanating from its body seemed to have a life of their own, moving in chaotic patterns, as if they wanted to swallow everything around them. It was not just a physical entity. It was something beyond that, something that transcended human understanding. I can't breathe," Kevin said, his eyes widening in terror. He tried to take a step back, but the sensation of being pulled toward the creature overwhelmed him. It's inside my head." Lisa felt the same way. It was as if the shadows were enveloping her, touching her mind, her spirit. The road was beyond any nightmare she had ever imagined. She tried to remain calm, but she felt as if she were being consumed by darkness. The voice of the entity, or whatever it was, echoed inside Lisa's mind, deep and unsettling. "You cannot escape. This road is your home now. You have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Lisa managed to ask, her voice nearly swallowed by the pressure. The entity seemed to hesitate, as if its presence was more a display of power than an actual answer. "Chosen to be a part of me, to be a part of the road, to be a part of the eternal cycle." Lisa, feeling the weight of the words, looked at the others. They were lost, immersed in the same sense of helplessness. They were no longer just victims of this road. They were now part of it. "We can't let this happen," John shouted, his voice thick with despair. He advanced toward the figure, his steps hesitant, as if he were being pulled back. But the moment he approached the entity, a wave of pain ran through him, as if the road itself were reacting to his attempt to confront what could not be confronted. He fell to the ground, gasping for breath, as if his entire being were being torn apart. "John!" Lisa shouted, running to him. But she knew there was nothing left to do. Whatever this entity was, it had already won. They were lost. She looked at the creature once more. She could feel the road invading her mind, making her question what was real and what wasn't. "What do you want from us?" Lisa asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you bring us here?" The entity moved closer, its form distorting even further, becoming a blur of shadows and nightmares. "I am the road. I am the end and the beginning. I am the prison and the freedom. I am what you call the curse. And now you are mine." Lisa felt the last of her resistance slipping away. There was no more hope. There was no more fight. They were part of the cycle now, and the road had consumed them. The others stood beside her, all silent, as if they were being taken over by the same inevitability. They could no longer run. The road, with its entity, had absorbed them, and now they were part of the eternal cycle. When Lisa's last resistance finally faded, She felt no fear. Not anymore. Just a sense of acceptance. The road, the entity, all of it was already part of her. She had been chosen, like everyone else, to be consumed by the eternity of this cursed road. And now the cycle was closing. The road was more alive than ever, and as the darkness swallowed everything around it, Lisa knew that the hunt would not end there. There was no end to it, only an eternal return to the beginning. The cycle was complete, but the road would never stop feeding, and the entity would continue to call, to pull more souls into its domain, keeping the fear and darkness alive forever. The end, however, was only a new beginning, and the road would continue its endless journey. The darkness was now an intrinsic part of the road. Lisa no longer felt the pain in her body, no longer felt the weight of the fear that had once consumed her. What was left was only a feeling of emptiness. She did not know if she was still human or if she had become something different, something bigger, older, an extension of the very road that now consumed her. The world around her was a blur, a mixture of shadows and fragments of what had once been landscapes. There was no more sky, no more stars or moon, only the road stretching endlessly, like an endless serpent, swallowing everything in its path. The trees, the bushes, the terrain, everything disappeared as they advanced, and the others, Mark, John, and Kevin, also seemed to be just echoes of what they had been before. They were with her, but they were no longer present. They were shadows of themselves, as if time and reality were being distorted around them. Lisa tried to scream, but could not hear her voice. She tried to move her legs, but they did not respond. The road had swallowed her completely. She no longer knew if she was walking or if she was being dragged. The sound of her own footsteps, which had once been a reminder of her humanity, was now just a whisper lost in the emptiness of the road. The road in front of her seemed endless, but it was also terribly familiar. Every curve, every undulation seemed repetitive, a repeated version of what she had already experienced. And she knew she wasn't alone. Something was watching her, something that had now become part of her existence. The entity hadn't abandoned her. It was there, ever present, even without form. Lisa felt its presence, as if it were a pressure on her mind, a feeling of being watched every second. Suddenly, the ground beneath her shook. It wasn't an earthquake, nor a storm. It was the road moving, twisting, as if it were alive. And then, from the void in front of her, a new form began to emerge. It was a tall figure, but without defined contours. Its body seemed to stretch and shrink, distorting the reality around it. The figure approached slowly, its presence stronger with each step. "You can't escape me, Lisa," the entity said, its deep, originless voice echoing across the road. "You're already in me. You always have been." Lisa felt a wave of panic spread through her body, but something strange happened. Instead of fighting, she felt calm. It was as if the road had taken complete control of her mind, leaving her with no will of her own. She no longer knew whether to run away or accept her fate. The cycle was complete, and she was part of it now. But why? Lisa finally managed to ask, her voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The entity moved closer still, and though its form was vague, the sense of its power was overwhelming. "I am the road. I am the eternal cycle. I am the beginning and the end. I am the one who controls all souls who cross this path." Lisa felt a growing weight on her chest, as if she were being compressed by an invisible force. "Were we chosen?" "Yes," the entity replied. "All who enter the road are chosen, but not all have the strength to understand what they truly are. You were part of something much greater, And now, you are the road, as I am. She tried to move, but her body would not obey her. There was no more escape, no more struggle. The only movement was the road, the entity, and the endless journey that never ended. Is there no end to this? She whispered. No, Lisa. The entity replied with eerie calm. The road never ends. It is the essence of what is eternal. You are now part of it. Lisa looked at the others, Mark, John, and Kevin. They were there, but they were no longer alive. Not in the way she knew them. They were only shadows, fragments of souls that had once been human, now trapped on the road, doomed to wander forever. They could no longer be saved. They were beyond redemption. The road, which had seemed like a common path, now revealed itself as a prison of souls, an entity that consumed everything that passed through it, transforming its victims into part of its endless cycle. Lisa felt a tear run down her face, but soon realized that it no longer mattered. What she had been, what she had become, no longer mattered. The world around her distorted again, and the road continued to stretch, longer, darker, more shadowy. Lisa now understood. She and the others were no longer on the road. They were the road. The cycle no longer consumed them. They were part of it. And as this happened, something began to emerge. A new wave of souls being drawn into the emptiness of the road. The entity looked at Lisa once more, its presence invading her mind with the sense of all that she had lost and gained. You will be the next watchman, the entity said. Now you understand what it means to be eternal. Now you will be part of my mission. Lisa felt the pain of acceptance, but also a deep emptiness. There was no more resistance. There was no more screaming. The cycle continued, and now she was part of it. She looked ahead, at the endless road that never ended, and saw what would be her eternal destiny. The road would never end. She no longer saw the lights of the headlights, nor the figures of those who had once been alive. It was all an illusion. The road was the only reality now. Lisa felt the weight of the road on her mind, and the entity no longer spoke. She knew what she must do. She must follow, like all the others before her, and watch the cycle, watching the souls being drawn to the road. She was now part of the whole. And so Lisa, along with the others, would wander the road forever, endless, without purpose, but forever connected to something greater than herself. The cycle would repeat itself, and she would be the road. Lisa now understood the road and her mission, but the cycle would continue, and new souls would be attracted, new victims who, once they passed through there, would also become part of the eternal road. You think you've heard everything about horror stories on the road. Prepare to get lost on a journey from which there is no escape. Comment below if you've ever had any strange experiences on deserted roads. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, click the subscribe button and activate the bell so you don't miss any new terrifying stories. Remember, the road never ends, and our next video may be the last thing you see.